The coffee hit the tile first, then the foil-wrapped sandwich, then a small paper cup of peach cobbler that Della had set aside special that morning. And for one whole second, nobody in the break room at the Ardmore Grand drew a breath. Garrett Stoll stood over the folding table, with the empty tray still in his hand, the way a man stands over something he's decided isn't worth his time. He was big in the way that men get big behind a desk, soft through the middle, but his voice filled the room. "You think this is a lunch counter? You think I hired you to sit?" He let the tray clatter down onto the cobbler. Peach syrup webbed across the floor. "On your knees. You came here to clean, so clean it. With your hands. Let everybody watch what they're worth." The man at the table didn't flinch. He looked at the mess, then at Garrett, and he set down the pen he'd been holding, slow and careful, like a person who had decided on something a long time ago and was only now arriving at it. "Are you done?" he asked. His voice was quiet, not weak, quiet the way a closed door is quiet. What Garrett Stoll didn't know, what nobody at the Ardmore Grand knew. Not Della behind him with her hand over her mouth, not the two front desk girls frozen in the doorway, not even the young woman in housekeeping gray, who had quietly slid her phone out of her apron pocket 30 seconds before, was that the man in the worn coveralls had spent the last 31 days writing down everything, and what he was about to lay on that table would burn the whole thing to the ground. 31 days before, a man stepped off a regional bus at the edge of Sable Creek, Georgia, carrying a duffel bag and a toolbox with somebody else's initials scratched off the lid. His name was Isaiah Calloway, and if you saw him on the road shoulder that afternoon, you would have guessed handyman. Maybe a roofer between jobs. Maybe a man chasing rumored work in a county where work was a rumor. He wore canvas pants, gone pale at the knee, steel-toe boots cracked across the toe, and a flannel shirt buttoned up against a wind that hadn't come yet. He had a way of holding still that people read as slow. He was not slow. He had just learned a long time ago that the man who moves last usually understands the most. Sable Creek was a town that the highway had forgotten on purpose. 9,000 people, 64% black, one grocery store with half its shelves bare, one clinic that closed at 4, and at the top of the bluff, behind a wrought iron gate and a long Magnolia Drive, the Ardmore Grand, a restored antebellum hotel with 200 rooms, a spa, a golf course carved into land that used to be something else, and a guest list that flew in from Atlanta and Charlotte to drink bourbon on a veranda and call it heritage. The Ardmore employed almost 400 people from Sable Creek and the 3 counties around it. Housekeepers, dishwashers, groundskeepers, line cooks, laundry, valets, nearly all of them black or brown, nearly all of them paid in a fog of withheld overtime, vanished tips, and paychecks that never quite matched the hours. Isaiah had read about all of it in a gray office in Atlanta 11 weeks earlier. He had sat with a stack of complaints 2 inches thick, run his thumb down the column of names, and stopped counting at 190. 190 workers who had filed wage claims against the Ardmore Grand over 6 years. Overtime never paid. Tips pooled and skimmed. Breaks deducted from checks. Workers fired the same week they asked a question. 190 claims, and not a single one had gone anywhere, because every one of them ran into the same wall. A settlement offer of $300 and a signature line on a paper that said you'd never speak of it again. Take it, or lose the job that was already killing you. That was the part Isaiah kept turning over, not the theft, the math of it. Somebody had figured out, down to the dollar, exactly how little a frightened person would accept to make the fear stop for a month. Somebody had built a machine out of that number, and the machine had a name on every dismissal, every denial, every settlement. Garrett Stoll, Director of Operations. His supervisor was a woman named Teresa Voorhees, and after Isaiah laid the file back on her desk, she sat with it for a while before she spoke. She was wage and hour division. She had been doing this for 22 years, and she did not waste words. "We've subpoenaed their records twice," she said. "Both times the records came back clean, beautiful, spotless, which means there are 2 sets of books, and the real one isn't in any file cabinet we're allowed to open." She slid a single sheet across the desk, a field authorization. So we stop asking for the books. We go get the truth from the people it was stolen from. You go in low. You go in as nobody. You work the floor. You eat in the break room. You listen. And you write down every hour they don't pay you. Because if they'll steal from a stranger they hired yesterday, they've been stealing from everyone for years. So there he was. Nobody. A handyman off a bus. He walked the 2 miles up the bluff road that first afternoon, and what he noticed first was the cars. Not guest cars, manager cars, idling. A white pickup parked at the mouth of the staff lot, with a man inside watching housekeepers clock in, writing something on a clipboard, each time the bus from town let workers off late. A second truck parked behind the laundry building, engine running, nobody pretending to do anything but watch. The Ardmore Grand did not feel like a hotel. It felt like a place that had learned to police the people who built it. He found a room to rent in town, on Tupelo Street, in a narrow house with a sagging porch and a hand-lettered sign in the window. The woman who answered the door was 61 years old, sharp-eyed, slow to smile, with a back held straight by something harder than pride. Her name was Della Hutchins, and she ran the housekeeping floor at the Ardmore 6 days a week and had for 19 years. She showed him the upstairs room, single bed, clean sheets, a window looking down the street toward the water tower, $40 a week. "You looking for work up the hill?" she asked, leaning in the doorframe. "Hoping to find some." She studied him the way you study weather coming in, not suspicious, careful. "They're always hiring up there," she said. "You ever wonder why a place that's always hiring never has enough people?" She didn't wait for an answer. She turned to go, and then she stopped, and her voice came down to a register people use when they're saying a thing they're tired of saying. "My grandson Caleb worked the kitchen there. 16, summer job. He clocked 49 hours 1 week and they paid him 32. And when his mama called to ask, Mr. Stoll told her if the boy couldn't count, he had no business operating a dish machine. And then he fired him for, and I'm quoting the paper they made him sign, attitude." She looked at Isaiah a beat too long. "You hear a lot of stories in this house. I've stopped expecting any of them to end." That night, Isaiah sat on the edge of the narrow bed and opened his laptop, the screen turned away from the window. He read 30 pages of what he'd already memorized. Photographs of paychecks beside time cards that didn't match. A spreadsheet of tip pools with numbers that leaked out the bottom into nowhere. A map of who got fired and when, color-coded, and the color bloomed every single time after a worker asked a question out loud. He closed the laptop. He set his reading glasses on the dresser. He went to the window, and down on Tupelo Street a hotel security truck rolled past slow, headlights sweeping the porches like it had every right to. He did not step back. He had 31 days. 31 days to scrub their floors and fix their air handlers and eat their bad coffee and watch what the Ardmore Grand did when it believed nobody who mattered was looking. He started Monday. They put him on maintenance, which meant he went everywhere. Boiler room, laundry, the kitchen behind the kitchen, the back hallways where the carpet stopped and the concrete started. Nobody looks at the man with the toolbox. He fixed a leaking valve and listened to two-line cooks talk about the overtime they'd worked off the clock. Because the time system glitched every Friday after 40 hours. He rewired a thermostat and listened to a laundry worker named Pearl explain, almost cheerfully, the way you talk about weather you can't change, that the hotel deducted a 30-minute lunch from every shift whether you took it or not, and nobody on the laundry floor had eaten lunch in years. He wrote it all down, not on the laptop. In a small spiral notebook he kept in his chest pocket, in shorthand only he could read, names, dates, hours, the exact dollars. He wrote down his own hours too, because they were stealing from him already. He'd worked 4 hours past clock out his first week, and the check came back showing 8 to 4, clean, like a lie told with a smile. And he watched Garrett Stoll. Garrett came into the staff areas at 9:15 most mornings. Same boots, same walk, shoulders rolled back, chin up, the walk of a man who owned the floor he crossed, not by deed, but by fear. He had a habit of stopping behind workers and standing there, just standing, until they felt him and froze. He had a habit of calling the men chief and boss and champ in a voice that meant none of it. He had a deputy, an assistant operations manager named Trent Hadley, 34, eager the way a small dog is eager beside a big one, who carried Garrett's clipboard and laughed at Garrett's jokes and signed the dismissal papers. Garrett dictated. Hadley wasn't cruel the way Garrett was cruel. He was something quieter and worse. He was a man who had decided, early and for good, that his comfort was worth more than the truth, and had been signing his name under that decision ever since. On Isaiah's 9th day, Garrett stopped behind him in the boiler room. Isaiah was on his back under a pump, and he felt the man arrive the way you feel a cloud cross the sun. "You're the new one," Garrett said. "Calloway." Isaiah slid out, sat up, wiped his hands. "Yes, sir. Where you come from?" "Up the road." "Different counties." "Up the road." Garrett tasted the words like he was checking them for something. "You work slow, Calloway. I've been watching. You take your time." "I take it right the first time," Isaiah said. "Saves doing it twice." Garrett looked at him for a moment, and something flickered in his face. Not concern, just the small irritation of a man used to a certain kind of answer who'd gotten a different one. "Don't get comfortable," he said finally. "Comfortable's how people forget what they are." And he walked out, and Isaiah picked his wrench back up, and in the notebook that night he wrote one more line. The town came to him slowly after that, the way it does once people decide you're safe. Della started leaving a plate for him on the kitchen table, told him things over coffee she'd never have told a stranger from the hotel. He met a groundskeeper named Otis Renfro, 70 years old, who had worked the Ardmore's lawns for 31 years, and been promised a pension that turned out, when he finally asked to see it, to be a filing cabinet with his name on an empty folder. He met a young dishwasher named Marcellus, who'd taken a second job at night, because the Ardmore paid him for 30 hours and worked him 50, and who fell asleep standing up at the sink, and who they wrote up for it. He met a single mother named Renee Tolliver in housekeeping, whose checks came up short so reliably that she had learned to budget around the theft, to plan her family's whole month around the money she earned and would not be given. And he met a young woman in housekeeping named Nia Foster, 23, who had grown up in Sable Creek and gone away to school for 1 year and come back when the money ran out, and who watched everything with a stillness that Isaiah recognized because it was his own. Nia did not complain. Nia took notes too. He caught her once, jotting times on the inside of her wrist with a pen. And when their eyes met across the laundry floor, neither of them said a word, but he understood. And she understood that he understood, and something passed between them that was older than language. The understanding of two people who have both decided, separately, that they are tired of being told their pain doesn't count. By the 4th week, Isaiah had it all. He had the off-the-clock overtime, named and dated, from 26 workers. He had the phantom lunch deductions running back years. He had the skimmed tip pool, the math of it, the exact percentage that leaked out before it reached the people who'd earned it. He had the dismissals that always followed a question. He had Garrett Stoll's voice on a dozen accounts, captured in the small ways power forgets itself, when it thinks no one important is in the room. He had, finally, a true picture of the machine, and the machine had run for years on the simplest fuel there is, the certainty that no one who could stop it would ever bother to come. He almost had what he needed to walk away and let the paperwork do the rest. He almost made it to the end clean, and then it was a Thursday, and it was 12:40 in the afternoon, and Isaiah Calloway sat down in the break room with a foil-wrapped sandwich Della had packed him and a small cup of peach cobbler she'd set aside special, and he opened his notebook to write down the morning's hours, and Garrett Stoll walked in. Garrett had been in a mood since the regional manager's call that morning. Somebody upstairs had asked about a wage complaint that wasn't supposed to exist. Garrett had spent 2 hours making it not exist again, and he had come down to the floor the way a man comes down to remind the ground who walks on it. He saw the new maintenance man sitting at the table, eating, writing in a little book, and something about it. The calm of it, the way the man didn't startle, got under his skin like a splinter. "What's that?" Garrett said. What are you writing? Isaiah closed the notebook, unhurried. Service notes. Boilers cycling rough. Stand up when I'm talking to you. Isaiah stood. Garrett stepped close enough that Isaiah could smell the coffee and the cologne and the morning's anger coming off of him. I've been watching you a month, Calloway. You sit when you should stand. You look when you should look down. You write things in a little book like you got business here. His eyes went to the table, to the sandwich, the cobbler, the cup of coffee, going cold. And you eat on my time like you earned it. And then he picked up the empty tray from the next table, and he swept it across Isaiah's lunch, and the coffee hit the tile first, then the sandwich, then the cobbler, and the room stopped breathing. On your knees, Garrett said, and his voice was the voice he used when he was sure no one who mattered was in the room. You came here to clean, so clean it, with your hands. Let everybody watch what they're worth. He had said versions of that sentence for years. He had watched men drop their eyes and reach for the mop, watched the fight leak out of them, watched them choose the paycheck over the last thing they had. He expected the same now. He expected the new man to flush, to mutter, to bend. Instead, Isaiah Calloway set his pen down on the table, slow and careful, and looked at him and said, "Are you done?" 3 words. The room rang with them. And then Isaiah reached into the chest of his coveralls. The movement slow, deliberate, his hand, crossing his body and coming back with something small and flat and black, a leather credential case, government issue, with a gold seal pressed into the cover that caught the fluorescent light, and threw a hard, bright line across Garrett Stoll's face. He set it on the table. He did not open it. He set it down the way you set down a thing that doesn't need explaining, centered. The seal turned to face the man across from him, and the gesture stripped the case of every harmless thing it might have been. The break room was so quiet you could hear the coffee dripping off the table edge onto the floor. Drip, drip, drip. Open it, Isaiah said, same quiet voice. But something underneath it had changed, a weight that hadn't been there a minute before. The voice of a man who was finished watching. Garrett didn't move. His eyes had dropped to the case and stuck there, the way a man's eyes stick to a shape in the dark, while his brain decides whether to run. I said, open it. Garrett reached out. His fingers found the leather. They were trembling, just slightly, the fine involuntary shake of a body receiving news the mind is still refusing. He flipped the cover. Inside, on the left, a photograph. Isaiah Calloway, clean-shaven, in a suit and tie, a man who looked nothing like the handyman who'd been scrubbing the boiler room for a month. Beside the photograph, a seal Garrett had only ever seen on documents he'd shredded. United States Department of Labor, Wage and Hour Division, and a name and title that turned the floor to water beneath him. Isaiah J. Calloway, Senior Investigator. On the right panel, a federal badge, heavy, real. Garrett's mouth came open. Nothing came out of it. Isaiah reached into his coveralls again and brought out a folded envelope, legal size, heavy stock, a blue seal stamped across the flap, and he laid it on the table beside the credentials. Federal Investigation Order, he said. Case number 24-0661. It names the Ardmore Grant, its parent company, and its named officers as the subject of an active wage theft and retaliation investigation. It has been open for 31 days. He paused and let it sink the way a stone sinks in still water. I have spent those 31 days working this floor, eating in this room, listening to the people you've been robbing, writing down every hour you didn't pay them, and every hour you didn't pay me. Garrett's face had gone the color of old paper, not white, not gray, the color a man turns when he watches his whole life start to drain out through the soles of his feet. You, he started. I'm not finished. The 2 words landed like a door slamming, and Garrett's mouth shut. Isaiah stood to his full height, and it was only then that everyone in the room understood how tall he was, a fact you couldn't see when he was bent under a pump or sitting at a folding table, playing the quiet man who bothered nobody. Standing, with the gold seal catching the light, he was something else entirely. In 31 days, he said, I have documented unpaid overtime for 26 workers, automatic meal break deductions affecting your entire hourly staff going back 6 years. systematic skimming of a pooled tip fund, and a pattern of terminating employees within one pay period of any inquiry into their wages. I have time records. I have payroll exports your own clerk handed me when I fixed the printer in the office she works in. I have witness statements. He looked at Garrett the way a doctor looks at a scan that confirms what he already knew. And as of about 90 seconds ago, I have 11 witnesses to a federal officer being assaulted in the course of an investigation. That's a separate felony. That one's just for you. You could hear the ice machine cycle behind the wall. You could hear the coffee still dripping. Drip, drip, drip like a clock counting down a thing that had already stopped. Della Hutchins stood by the door, with both hands pressed to her chest and tears standing in her eyes that she did not wipe. 19 years she had cleaned those rooms and counted those short checks and watched that man break her grandson and her neighbors. Now she watched him stand with shaking hands and a badge in front of him that meant nothing, and a federal seal on a folding table that meant everything. Trent Hadley had backed up against the soda machine, his clipboard pressed to his chest like it could shield him, his face, the face of a man, watching the chain of command he'd served for years lead, straight off the edge of a cliff he'd helped build. And in the corner, where she'd been standing the whole time, Nia Foster slowly lowered her phone. She had started recording the moment Garrett walked in. She had it all: the tray, the words, the credentials, the silence. She would not learn until later that her steadiness in that minute would become the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case. Isaiah picked up the credential case, closed it, slid it back inside his coveralls. He held the envelope out. Garrett took it. His hands shook so badly the paper rattled. Then Isaiah stepped around the spreading mess on the floor, the coffee and the ruined cobbler, and walked out of the break room, and he did not look back. What happened after that did not happen fast, because justice on paper never does. But it happened. The Department of Labor's full case opened within the week, and once it was federal, the records the Ardmore had kept so beautifully clean stopped protecting anyone, because the real numbers were in the workers' own pay stubs and time photos, and in Nia Foster's recording, and in a notebook full of shorthand that a senior investigator had been keeping for 31 days. The parent company's lawyers came in hard, and then, when they saw what was in the file, came in quiet. Garrett Stoll was indicted on federal charges of wage theft, retaliation against workers, and assault on a federal officer in the performance of his duties. He stood in a courtroom in Macon 11 months later and watched his own voice play through the speakers, watched the cell phone video of a folding table and a tray and 3 words, and the camera caught his hands the whole time, and his hands never stopped shaking. He is no longer the director of anything. Trent Hadley, who agreed to testify rather than stand beside the man whose papers he'd signed, kept his freedom and lost everything else, which is its own kind of sentence for a man who traded his name away one signature at a time. The Ardmore Grand was placed under a federal consent decree for 6 years. An independent monitor was installed, with full access to every payroll system, every time clock, every books. The phantom lunch deduction was abolished. The tip pool was rebuilt with a federal auditor watching the math. And the stolen wages, 6 years of them, run through forensic accountants until the number was solid, came to $4,100,000. A judge ordered every dollar of it returned. Renee Tolliver got back the money she'd budgeted her whole life around and never once been given. She told Della. She sat in her car in the lot for half an hour with the check in her hand before she could drive home. Otis Renfro, 70 years old, got the pension that had been an empty folder, with 31 years of interest stacked on top, and he retired the following spring and bought a fishing boat he'd wanted since 1981. Marcellus, the dishwasher, who fell asleep standing up, got back wages and a written apology, and quit the same week to start the welding course the money finally let him afford. Caleb, Della's grandson, the 16-year-old fired for attitude, got a check too, and a letter that struck the word attitude from his record. And the boy framed the letter, which Della says she will never understand but secretly loves him for. 190 claims had been filed against the Ardmore Grand over 6 years. Not every one of them could be made whole. Some of the people who filed them had moved away. Some had passed, some had buried the thing so deep that no check could reach the bottom of it. But for the first time in anyone's memory, in Sable Creek, asking a question about your own paycheck was no longer the same as quitting your job. It was a thing you were allowed to do. And in a town that had been trained, paycheck by paycheck, to expect nothing, that turned out to be very close to everything. 5 months after the consent decree, on a cool, bright Saturday, Isaiah Calloway came back to Sable Creek. He came on the same regional bus, stepped off at the same shoulder of the road, carried the same duffel and the same toolbox with the scratched lid, wore the same flannel buttoned against a wind that hadn't come, not because he needed the disguise anymore, but because it was his jacket. And he was the kind of man who wore a thing until it was finished, not until it was out of style. He walked up Tupelo Street, and the porches were the same and the water tower was the same, but the security trucks were gone. And a girl was riding her bike down the middle of the road like she owned it, which she did. Della Hutchins opened her door before he knocked. She looked at him standing there in his worn flannel with the duffel over his shoulder. And something moved across her face too big for any single word. Relief and grief and pride, all braided together. The look of a woman who waited 19 years for someone to walk up her street and change one thing, and was now looking at the someone and trying to figure out how on earth you thank a person for doing what should never have needed doing. "You eating?" was all she said, finally. He was. She'd made too much the way she always had, and she set a plate in front of him at the same kitchen table, and there was cobbler on it, peach, made fresh that morning. He looked at the plate. He looked at her. "This one stays on the table," Della said, and Isaiah Calloway smiled. A small, quiet thing that didn't ask for anything and didn't announce anything. The smile of a man who had found, in a plate of food set down without fear, the only receipt he ever needed. He ate slow. He thanked her twice. And when he left the next morning for the bus, he set 5 20s under the edge of the plate, where the wind wouldn't take them. And he didn't look back, because the table was still there, and the chair was still there. And anyone in Sable Creek could now sit down at the end of a week's work and be paid for every hour of it, which is a small thing and the only thing. But here is what the numbers told him on the ride out, watching the water tower shrink behind the glass. Sable Creek was one town, one hotel, one tray of food on one floor. And across this country, in kitchens and warehouses and laundries, and on the night shift of 100,000 places where the work is hard and the people are tired, and someone upstairs has done the cold arithmetic of exactly how little a frightened person will accept. How many checks are coming up short right now, this week, this Friday, with nobody writing it down? How many Garrett Stolls are still standing behind somebody, just standing, waiting for them to feel it and freeze? How many Dellas are setting a plate aside and saying nothing? And how many people are sitting at a folding table on their lunch break, doing the math on a paycheck that doesn't add up, wondering if it's worth the question, wondering if anyone anywhere is finally about to walk in? So, let me ask you something, and I mean it. Have you ever been made to feel like you didn't count? Like your work, your time, your dignity was a line item somebody decided they could shave? Tell me in the comments who got to you most in this one. Isaiah's patience, Otis getting his 31 years back, or Naya in the corner with the steadiness to hit record when it mattered. And if this story moved you, stay close, because every week we tell you about the people who refuse to look down. The next one might be standing on your floor right now, holding a toolbox, writing everything down.